Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the How To Academy. I'm David Malone, and it's my pleasure this evening to talk to Alex Riley. Good evening, Alex.
Evening. Good to see you.
Alex is an award-winning freelance science writer. He's written for BBC, PBS, New Scientist, amongst others. And this, A Cure for Darkness, is his first book. And a rather splendid book it is too, Alex, but covers an enormous amount of territory. I mean, it is admittedly depression, a very large subject. In some ways, it comes across as a search for the cure, the treatment. But I couldn't help but feel at the same time it was as much a search for an understanding of what it is people were trying to cure. Is it a disease like COVID, or is it more like a nut allergy? Something natural which just gets out of hand.
Yeah, exactly.
What's your feeling about that? What is it?
Well, it was also a search for my understanding of it, as my family history and trying to reach outside of my own personal experience and trying to find answers from other people from not only history but from around the world. And yeah, what is depression? I think it's something that's so malleable through time. It's something that's shaped by people's culture, how they speak, how they connect to their bodies, and this really comes across when you look cross-culturally of how depression is defined by different terms. Like depression is quite a westernized term for the mental illness that we call depression, for the low mood, the depression, whereas around the world you can focus on other parts of this illness that can be thinking too much is a very common one, and that kind of comes across when I travel to Zimbabwe, where for a long time depression wasn't even considered to be a thing. And how do you treat someone who doesn't believe that they're ill, and all of their family members and neighbors say no one's depressed in Zimbabwe, this isn't a thing here. And so you have to kind of find what is the term that really sort of captures this syndrome, this mental illness that can be anything from suicide to low mood to loss of appetite, gain of appetite, someone who's not sleeping, someone who sleeps too much, and then the anxiety and all these sort of comorbid symptoms that come with what we call depression. So yeah, it's a real shape-shifting illness, and the understanding of it, we're still not really there yet. We don't have a biomarker for it. We have sort of correlations between inflammation and sort of symptoms, but that's as best as we have right now. We don't really have a sort of, this is the cell, if you will, like of cancer. We have different types of cells that kind of divide, and they're called different types of cancer, whereas with depression we don't have that, and we don't even have a genetic marker for it because it's so diffuse. So it was really a search for understanding, and I think what's even more amazing, we don't have this understanding, and yet we still have treatments that work.
Yes, I mean, in some ways it's not surprising. I was thinking that if you have a problem with your kidney, it means you're going to have a problem urinating. If you've got a problem with your heart, you're going to have a problem with your circulation, your ability to get about, because those organs do relatively circumscribed things, but the mind does so much. I mean, it's how you hope, or how you fear, or how you love, or make friends, or it's how you regret. And so if something goes wrong with the mind, it's going to affect so many different things. Is that part, do you think, of why, as you say, it's such a protean malady, affliction, that it presents in so many different ways?
Yeah, and it's the mind is something we really struggle to define itself. Like memories, we struggle to understand how that works. Consciousness, we're still have very many theories of what consciousness is, and still we don't really have a kind of leading theory for that. And emotions as well, and all these things are sort of like part of our experience of depression, and yet none of them are defined. So how could we expect this illness, this mental illness, to be defined? And then outside of the mind, it's also very physical illness. It can be caused by a whole range of sort of malfunctions in the body. We have this term from history of endogenous depression, which is very much a bodily disease that is often seen as more of a a severe disease. It responds better to biological treatments. It's more of a psychiatric disorder than something of the mind, which is more of a history and Freudian sort of environment and upbringing and all of these different things. So yeah, we've got both biology and the mind kind of combining into this one syndrome that we call depression, which right now is called major depressive disorder in one of the leading psychiatric manuals, where if you look in history, it had all of these amazing sort of diversity. And that's one of the things that I really try and bring out of the book, is this diversity can then be both informative for the person who's suffering from this, and then also from which treatment might actually be effective.
Yes, that comes across strongly in the book, that in
Good.
the past, there was a much richer vocabulary perhaps, to describe what was a whole range of I don't know what you would call them, afflictions or feelings even, but the vocabulary was much richer. And some of that seems that there's been an impoverishment in some way as we've tried to medicalize it, that our ability to describe it in terms which capture the whole range has actually gone down. I mean, there's a lovely bit at the beginning of the book. You quote Freud when he's talking about the sub or the unconscious, and the possibility that depression is a disease of this subconscious. And you quote him saying that the subconscious, the possibility that there could be powerful mental processes which nevertheless remain hidden from the consciousness of man. And then you go on yourself on the same page. It's a lovely sentence. You say, of the unconscious, a place where repressed thoughts, traumatic memories, and the ancestral urges of our species were thought to play behind bars, a psychical labyrinth locked away from everyday life. And there's something about that description which I felt you tapped into the original richness of trying to think about depression, rather than just saying, oh, it's a problem with your serotonin uptake.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's I mean, when I first started writing the book, I thought that I wouldn't include Freud. And when I spoke to people,
why did you think that?
Because it started off as a science book, and I thought, surely Freud can't be, he's pseudoscience. This isn't, this isn't, seen as something that's a serious, level-headed academic would publish. And yeah, that's true for a lot of his stuff. I don't need to go into the details of what he, thought about, but we know some of the most radical theories. But then I started reading, a lot of his earlier work, and he came from an academic background. He, was convinced that cocaine was a cure for depression, and he really came from this sort of biological psychiatry. And then he tried his own theory of, trying to describe how neurons work in the brain. And he was this really, amazing young scientist. And cocaine, his sort of like, I guess his loyalty to this was actually part of his undoing in this academic line of work, because he became criticized for spreading, addiction around Europe and the US, because he was one of the most, vocal academics supporting cocaine. And he kind of turned his back on academia, and then he started creating his own science. And so I used to say to people when I was interviewing people that, this is going to start with Emil Kraepelin, who is seen as the father of biological psychiatry, and maybe there's no room for Freud. But I think a lot of his ideas around depression are just as valid today as they were when he proposed them. I mean, this idea of, early upbringing being vital, and these ideas of losing a love object. I mean, they're psychoanalytical thoughts, but you can just see the relevance today. Like, we know that depression, it thrives on people who have lost loved ones, or loved certain things like their job, or where they live, and these things, they can then create the depressive reaction, as he would say. And yeah, so I completely flipped, and wanted to learn more about this guy, and found myself almost sort of thinking, seeing my own experience through his. He suffered from depression himself and tried every method to try and cure himself. So yeah, this idea of being conscious, then it's become as I finish with it in the end of the book, you know, it finishes with this sort of this almost beautiful like union between biological psychiatry and Freudian psychoanalysis with the current use of psychedelics. This idea that, you know, these drugs open people up to display their childhood traumas. And yes, I was speaking to patients who've undergone some of the, you know, clinical trials into psilocybin and ayahuasca, and you know, the sort of experiences they see, that they don't just see them as like dreams, they see them as, you know, these things are just as real as the day that happened, but there's none of the emotional sort of baggage that comes with it, and they're able to kind of deal with that unconscious, that thing that I mentioned that is, you know, locked behind bars, is opened, but in a very safe setting.
We see it's interesting because in that description, although it's, you know, it would be easy to say, well, it's just a sort of the author being a bit flamboyant with words, but that would be to do a disservice, because in the Freudian look at depression, it's merely just taking very seriously that the mind, there might not be anything chemically wrong with the mind, but the mind itself can just get itself in trouble. There can be something wrong with your thinking as a separate thing from the mechanism which is doing the thinking. I mean, obviously, if something mechanical, chemical goes wrong with this machine that's doing the thinking, fine. But is it not possible that the machine itself is not malfunctioning? One of the valves hasn't broken. There isn't a rod or a cone or a belt that's come loose, but that the thinking it's doing is wrong. And so, if you're going to represent that as a possibility, that the mind can just go wrong at the level of its thoughts, then you can't dismiss the more psychological aspects, can you?
But I would argue that there's a biological basis to that. I mean, I'm still very much grounded in, you know, the scientific argument that there's no sort of ephemeral sort of tangential part of the brain that isn't, you know, biological in its nature, which has been I think that what we're talking about when we talk about, you know, thoughts being dysfunctional, it doesn't necessarily mean, you know, your serotonin or dopamine or at least the receptors in the brain are malfunctioning. But I do think that it's either something we don't fully understand, or it's to do with brain circuitry. So, you know, these pathways in the brain that might become overused and dominant, you know, these pathways are so easily they easily slide towards sort of a depressive outlook, which is why cognitive behavioral therapy can be so effective, that it's not just a psychological therapy. It actually has the power to, you know, help you rewire those, or maybe not rewire them, but it has the power to almost modulate them and manage them in a more positive way. I think that's what I would say, is that the psychological and biological can't be separated. But yes, to say that it's just a serotonin disorder is almost insulting to people who, you know, have suffered, and then also just, you know, completely it misses this much richer history and this much richer understanding that we do have. And that said, SSRIs, you know, obviously I write about my experience with them in the book, and you know, I think they're incredibly powerful, but there's not really that much evidence that serotonin is the key driver here. It seems antidepressants work through serotonin because it's got other pathways that it's connected to. We're not really getting at the heart of what the problem is.
No, I mean, in some ways, it's when you talk about CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy, you point out that it has two parents. There's behaviorism, the sort of standard 1950s behaviorism, and then cognitive therapy. And the difference you point out between in the book is that although we think of it's fashionable to think of behaviorism as sort of more old-fashioned, and in many ways wrong, people like to think, its emphasis was there's something harmful in your environment which you're reacting to, and therefore so from the point of view of behaviorism, you know, poverty and a poverty of hope and awful living conditions would be what they'd say, well, that's the environment, do something about it. Whereas their complaint about the cognitive therapy you point out is that in some ways you're just treating people, you might be just treating people's ability to cope with an awful life.
Yeah.
So you're not treating the cause at all. You're just deadening the symptoms of their unhappiness. And
Yeah.
there's something to that, is there not?
Yeah, I think that I really enjoyed reading about, you know, the behaviorist outlook, and I think that I align to that. But it's incredibly idealistic to think that these things are going to be going away anytime soon. Like, yes, we'd love to live in this sort of nirvana of, you know, of peace and peace and happiness, and, you know, no poverty and none of these social triggers. Yes, I think, you know, that'd be great, but that's not the world we live in. And there's the argument that if we sort of blunt the pain, that we don't actually target those elements, the social triggers of mental illness. And I think there's some truth to that. But again, our treatments aren't so good as to say, oh, because of these treatments, people are forgetting that their social situation is bad. I think we're just allowing people to have a leg up against that. And yeah, it's funny how cognitive behavior therapy is something that is two fields that hated each other, and they argued that both were irrelevant or both were wrong, and then it became one of the most powerful psychological treatments for depression.
Yes. I mean, when you're going through the history, you mention Bertha Pappenheim, I can't remember how you say her name, who was back in Freud's, and she was a fascinating figure because, as you point out, she was treated with the sort of a talking cure, but it didn't actually cure her. It helped. No. But that, as you say in the book, what cured her was finding, here was a woman who was born to a religious family at a time when women were really not allowed to do anything. She was obviously fiercely intelligent. And what cured her, you point out, is when she found her meaning and purpose in life. She became one of the most leading and famous feminists of her time, and she had a purpose. And that surely points towards this is at least for some people, an ailment of their hopes and their thoughts as much as their chemistry or their genes.
Yeah, exactly. And that didn't come to light for a while after she was given that treatment. So, you know, she was said to be cured by this new talking cure that had come from Freud, and, you know, it was completely, I don't know whether they lied or they just didn't, you know, see what had happened to her, but she was institutionalized very soon after having the so-called talking cure. And yeah, like you say, the only thing that really helped, I'm not sure it cured her, but the thing that helped her was to find purpose. And I think that's probably one of the most effective treatments we have. It's not something that we can sort of prescribe, but what the treatments that we have can do is allow people to, it's not going to, you know, just make their lives immediately better and good. I think it gives them a leg up to be able to find that purpose and, you know, keep that, if they're, you know, either suicidal or severely depressed, you know, allow them to avoid, you know, really severely hurting themselves or you know, killing themselves, and allowing them to find that purpose that they may have either not have or just haven't really realized that they already have already. And this is something, you know, as a writer, I kind of come across in myself most years, days, and it's just, you know, what is my purpose? I'm, you know, in a solitary existence behind a desk, and every 4 years, you know, I might publish a book and talk to people. And
well, I mean, that's partly why I raised it, because you are in the book, you're willing to talk about your own experience, and although you're not trying to write a book about yourself, so it's done with a light touch. The similarity between Bertha and yourself, in the sense that you in some sense been helped by finding you have a purpose now. You've written a book which will help people.
I think the purpose was more during the research, and, you know, I have a purpose to be able to, you know, have this amazing opportunity. I have publishers that want to support me. I think there's a huge amount of okay, what's next now? And I think myself, I've been struggling over the last few months because that purpose seems to have died down. And yeah, I think for me, I'm not currently taking antidepressants for the first time in a while. And yeah, it's kind of, that purpose is something I'm striving to find again. I have a few ideas for new books, and I have, but it's very difficult to then, after 4 years of having this sort of dedication to a topic, over 4 years now, to then, find that again. And I think once I do, like Bertha at Pappenheim, and I think I will be more stable for when I have that in my life.
Yes. Well, I mean,